The first sign that the neighborhood had changed came not with a knock or a warning, but with a thin white envelope tucked precisely under the edge of my mailbox flag, aligned so carefully it looked intentional, almost ceremonial, as if the neighborhood itself were making a statement. This place had once been quiet in a forgettable way, the kind of suburban sprawl where the days blended together, and the only real measure of time was the slow growth of hedges and the seasonal rotation of lawn decorations. Lawns here were not just yards. They were statements of compliance, measured in inches, trimmed in straight lines, fed with chemicals that kept everything a uniform shade of obedient green. When I moved in, I understood the unspoken rule immediately. The grass did not belong to you, not really. It belonged to the association, to the idea of order they worshipped more than community. Still, I had believed that if I kept to myself, paid my dues, and caused no disruptions, I would remain invisible, which in this neighborhood was the highest form of success. That illusion shattered the moment I opened the envelope and saw the fine. The paper was stiff, the font aggressive in its neatness, the wording cold and detached, explaining that my lawn exceeded the maximum allowable height by exactly 1 inch. The number was precise, almost proud of itself, and so was the amount attached to it, a sum large enough to sting but small enough to feel intentionally humiliating. There was no warning, no prior notice, no courtesy reminder, only a penalty and a deadline, followed by a list of escalating consequences should the violation continue. Standing there in the afternoon sun, listening to the distant hum of lawnmowers from neighbors who had already internalized the fear of noncompliance, I felt something shift inside me, not anger at first, but curiosity. Over the next few days, I watched the neighborhood more closely than I ever had before, noticing details that had always been there but never mattered until now. I noticed how uneven some lawns actually were when you looked past the illusion of uniformity, how patches of grass near fences grew higher where no one bothered to check, how certain corners of yards were always ignored because they were harder to reach. I noticed how the HOA patrol vehicle moved slowly through the streets at predictable times, how enforcement seemed selective, almost performative, as if the rules existed more as tools than standards. I paid the fine without comment, without appeal, without drawing attention to myself, and that silence was mistaken for acceptance. What the association did not realize was that by measuring my lawn so precisely, they had given me a ruler not just for grass, but for the entire neighborhood. I spent evenings reading through the HOA bylaws, not skimming, but studying them like a map, absorbing the language, the loopholes, the contradictions hidden beneath the surface of enforced order. The rules were thick, dense, and obsessed with detail, specifying acceptable heights, approved plant species, prohibited growth patterns, and maintenance schedules that bordered on obsessive. Buried among those pages was a recurring phrase that caught my attention again and again, a phrase that applied not just to me but to every homeowner equally, a phrase that emphasized uniform enforcement without exception. The rules demanded consistency, and consistency was their weakness. As the days passed, I stopped cutting my grass entirely, letting it grow naturally, watching as small wildflowers pushed through the green, insects returned, birds lingered longer in the mornings. My yard began to look different, not neglected, but alive in a way the neighborhood was not used to seeing. Predictably, another notice arrived, this one sterner, heavier with implied authority, warning of further fines and possible intervention. What they did not know was that I had already begun documenting everything, not just my own lawn, but the entire street, the corners they ignored, the standards they failed to uphold when it suited them. Early mornings and late afternoons became my observation hours, camera in hand, quietly recording the reality behind the perfection. I captured overgrown strips behind hedges, uneven cuts, untrimmed edges, all carefully time-stamped and cataloged. The more I documented, the clearer it became that my lawn was not an exception. It was simply visible, and visibility was the true violation. The neighborhood itself seemed to sense the tension, a subtle unease settling over the streets as my yard continued to grow, transforming slowly from a violation into a statement. Neighbors began to glance a little longer when they passed, some with confusion, some with judgment, others with something closer to curiosity. The association responded with escalating pressure, more notices, more fines, each one reinforcing their belief that control was inevitable, that compliance was only a matter of time. But control relies on imbalance, and imbalance cannot survive scrutiny. By the end of that first week, my lawn had become a quiet anomaly, a patch of unmanaged green in a sea of regulated conformity, and the association had unknowingly set the stage for something far larger than a dispute over grass height. As I stood at my window one evening, looking out over a neighborhood that believed order was unbreakable, I understood that this was no longer about my yard at all. It was about rules applied selectively, about authority assumed rather than earned, about a system that thrived on silence and crumbled under attention. The jungle had not yet spread beyond my property, but the seeds were already planted, and as the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across perfectly trimmed lawns, it became clear that the next phase would not be quiet, and the neighborhood was not prepared for what was coming next. The second week began with a subtle shift in the neighborhood's rhythm, a tension that hummed beneath the surface like a power line carrying too much current. My lawn had crossed the threshold from violation to spectacle, no longer just taller than allowed but visibly different, textured and uneven in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The grass moved when the wind passed through it, bending and rising again, while the rest of the neighborhood lay flat and silent, clipped into submission. From my front window, I watched people slow their cars as they drove by, their heads turning slightly, their expressions tightening with discomfort. In a place where predictability was prized above all else, unpredictability felt like a threat. The association escalated quickly, their responses growing sharper, the language of their notices less administrative and more punitive, emphasizing compliance, consequences, and the inevitability of enforcement. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, as though the paper itself carried the weight of authority. But I continued to respond in the same way, calmly, methodically, documenting, observing, and waiting. What the HOA did not anticipate was how contagious attention could be once it broke the surface. Neighbors who had never spoken to me beyond polite nods began to linger at the edge of their driveways, pretending to adjust sprinklers or check mail while their eyes drifted toward my yard. Some wore expressions of quiet judgment, others confusion, and a few something closer to reluctant admiration. The illusion of absolute order was cracking, and everyone could see it. Behind the scenes, I expanded my documentation, moving beyond my immediate street and into adjacent blocks, mapping patterns of neglect that had gone unnoticed because no one had ever challenged the narrative of uniform compliance. I found lawns that exceeded the height limit by more than mine ever had, hidden behind fences or partially shaded by trees. I found properties owned by board members with irregular maintenance schedules, grass that grew freely near property lines, corners that violated the same bylaws they enforced so rigidly on others. Every discovery reinforced the same conclusion. Enforcement was not about rules, it was about visibility and control. As my lawn continued to grow, something unexpected happened. The natural growth began to change the atmosphere of my property in ways that were impossible to deny. Pollinators returned in numbers I had never seen before, butterflies drifting lazily across the yard, bees clustering around small blooms that had been absent for years. Birds landed openly, no longer startled by the mechanical roar of weekly mowing. The yard became quieter and louder at the same time, filled with life rather than noise. This contrast did not go unnoticed, and it unsettled people. A neighborhood built on the promise of sanitized perfection suddenly had a living example of an alternative, and that alternative challenged the unspoken assumption that control equaled beauty. The HOA's response grew increasingly public, their patrols more frequent, their presence more performative. Vehicles slowed conspicuously in front of my house, stopping just long enough to be seen by passers-by, as if visibility alone could restore authority. Notices were no longer discreetly placed, but delivered with deliberate emphasis. The sound of them sliding into place meant to be heard. Still, no direct confrontation came, only layers of pressure designed to wear me down quietly. What they did not realize was that each escalation drew more attention, not just from me, but from the neighborhood itself. Conversations began to ripple outward, quiet at first, then bolder, as neighbors compared experiences, fines, warnings, and inconsistencies they had long accepted as normal. My lawn had become a focal point, a reference in discussions that questioned why some violations were punished while others were ignored. The association's insistence on uniformity had inadvertently created a standard against which it could now be measured, and it was failing. I continued to let the grass grow, not recklessly, but intentionally, observing how quickly perception shifted from annoyance to intrigue. The yard no longer looked abandoned. It looked intentional, almost curated in its wildness, a stark contrast to the sterile uniformity around it. Children stopped to watch insects near the sidewalk, parents hesitating before pulling them away, unsure whether curiosity or compliance should win. The HOA's internal communications, which I would later obtain, revealed a growing unease, discussions about precedent, about loss of control, about the danger of allowing one exception to stand. They debated intervention strategies, weighing the optics of forced maintenance against the risk of appearing heavy-handed. What they failed to understand was that the neighborhood was already watching, already judging, already questioning. The rules they relied on had become a spotlight, and every inconsistency was now illuminated. As the days passed, I noticed subtle changes in other yards, grass left a little longer, edges less sharply defined, small acts of quiet defiance that mirrored my own. No one announced it, no one acknowledged it openly, but the shift was there, spreading slowly, organically, like the growth they feared. The association's authority depended on isolation, on making examples of individuals, but the moment those individuals began to see themselves as part of a pattern, that authority weakened. By the end of the second week, my lawn had become more than a personal protest. It had become a symbol, a living demonstration of how fragile enforced order could be when confronted with consistency and attention. The HOA had intended to correct a minor violation, and instead had exposed the cracks in its foundation. Standing in my yard one evening, watching the sun cast golden light across uneven blades of grass and distant, perfectly trimmed lawns beyond, I sensed the neighborhood holding its breath. This was no longer just about grass height or fines or rules buried in paperwork. It was about who controlled the space people lived in, who decided what was acceptable, and how quickly that control could unravel once people stopped looking away. The jungle was no longer contained to my property in spirit, even if it was in fact, and the next chapter would test whether the association could contain what it had already set in motion. By the third week, the neighborhood was no longer pretending that nothing unusual was happening. The tension that had once lived quietly beneath trimmed hedges and polite nods now pressed against the surface, visible in the way people moved through shared spaces and lingered in conversations that used to end quickly. My lawn had grown into its role as a disruption, not because of its height alone, but because of what it represented. It was no longer just grass exceeding a measurement. It was a refusal to accept selective authority, and that refusal had begun to resonate. The association intensified its efforts, but in doing so revealed how fragile its control really was. Notices arrived faster, their tone sharper, referencing escalating procedures and hinting at forced compliance measures. The language was precise but anxious, layered with repetition as though repeating the rules could compensate for their waning influence. Each letter followed the same structure, outlining violations, penalties, and expectations, yet each one felt more desperate than the last. I continued to respond in the same way I always had, by not responding at all, choosing instead to let their words stack up like unused tools. Meanwhile, my documentation expanded beyond lawns into patterns of behavior. I noticed how enforcement vehicles appeared more often near my house, but avoided certain streets entirely. I observed how board member properties seemed untouched by scrutiny, their minor violations quietly overlooked. The rules that were supposedly absolute bent easily around influence and convenience, and that bending had become visible to anyone willing to look. Neighbors began to talk openly now, no longer whispering comparisons, but exchanging stories with cautious honesty. Small gatherings formed at the edges of driveways, conversations stretching longer as people realized they were not alone in their frustrations. My lawn was mentioned often, not as a complaint, but as a catalyst, a shared reference that allowed people to speak without naming deeper grievances outright. The association tried to counter this shift with visibility, increasing patrols and inspections, staging enforcement as a reminder of authority. Instead, those patrols became symbols of overreach, drawing attention to inconsistencies rather than correcting them. Children pointed out the vehicles, parents watched them pass with expressions that were no longer neutral. The yard itself continued to evolve, growing denser, richer, less predictable. Native plants took hold, filling spaces that uniform grass never had, creating layers of green that changed with the light. Insects multiplied, birds nested, the space becoming undeniably alive. This life contrasted sharply with the sterile surroundings, and that contrast unsettled people more than neglect ever could have. The association attempted to reframe the narrative, circulating general reminders about community standards, emphasizing property values and shared responsibility. These messages felt hollow now, disconnected from the reality residents were witnessing daily. Property values had not dropped, streets had not fallen into chaos, and the world had not ended because one lawn defied uniformity. The fear that had sustained compliance began to lose its grip. I noticed more lawns slipping subtly out of regulation, not dramatically, but enough to suggest intentional choice. Grass left uncut for an extra week, edges allowed to blur, weeds tolerated rather than immediately removed. These small acts were not coordinated, but they were connected by a growing awareness that enforcement was inconsistent and authority negotiable. The association responded unevenly, issuing warnings here, ignoring violations there, struggling to maintain the illusion of control while avoiding open conflict. Their internal strain leaked into the neighborhood through delays, contradictory notices, and moments of visible hesitation. What had once been a rigid system now appeared reactive, uncertain, and exposed. I continued to document everything, aware that the story unfolding was larger than any single fine or violation. This was about how power functioned when questioned, how quickly fear dissolved when people realized it was selectively applied. The lawn had become a living record of that realization, growing steadily, unapologetically, refusing to return to a state of obedience simply because it was demanded. By the end of the third week, the neighborhood felt fundamentally altered. The silence that once defined it had been replaced by observation, by curiosity, by a cautious willingness to question. The association prepared its next escalation, confident that stronger measures would restore order. What it did not yet understand was that the community was no longer waiting for permission to think for itself, and whatever came next would force that truth into the open. The fourth week arrived with an intensity that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence, the kind of pressure that settles into a place when authority senses its grip slipping and responds by tightening too hard. The neighborhood still looked orderly from a distance, but up close it felt strained, like something pulled too tight and close to tearing. My lawn had crossed another invisible line, no longer merely tolerated as a curiosity or discussed as a problem, but treated as a direct challenge to the structure that governed the community. The association's response reflected that shift. Notices continued to arrive, but now they carried the weight of inevitability, outlining next steps with an air of finality, referencing corrective action, third-party intervention, and the possibility of the HOA stepping in to resolve the violation themselves. The language was colder, stripped of any pretense of cooperation, revealing the core belief that compliance was not optional, only delayed. Yet even as the association escalated, its certainty was undermined by the reality unfolding around it. The neighborhood was no longer unified in quiet obedience. Lawns that had once been maintained with obsessive regularity now showed signs of selective neglect, intentional in their subtlety. Grass grew unevenly along fence lines, weeds lingered longer than before, and trimming schedules drifted just enough to blur the rigid boundaries residents had once followed without question. These changes were not dramatic, but they were cumulative, and they told a story the association could not control. My documentation continued, expanding into a broader archive of inconsistency, not just in law enforcement, but in how rules were communicated, applied, and ignored depending on who was involved. Patterns emerged that were impossible to dismiss, revealing a system built less on fairness than on convenience and visibility. The yard itself had become something undeniable. It was no longer simply tall grass, but a layered ecosystem, dense with growth, shifting daily in texture and color. Wild plants filled the spaces between blades, insects moved freely, birds returned regularly, and the air around it felt different, quieter yet alive. The contrast between this and the surrounding lawns was stark, and that contrast unsettled people because it challenged the assumption that strict control equaled beauty or value. Neighbors lingered longer now when passing, some pausing outright, drawn not by defiance but by curiosity, by the unexpected realization that something different could exist without immediate collapse. The association attempted to counter this by reframing the narrative, emphasizing order, standards, and the threat of decline if rules were not enforced uniformly. But the emphasis on uniformity rang hollow as more residents noticed how selectively those rules had always been applied. Enforcement patrols became erratic, sometimes intense, sometimes absent, exposing internal disagreement and uncertainty. The association was struggling to decide whether to assert control decisively or retreat quietly to avoid backlash, and that indecision was visible to everyone watching. The fear that once kept people compliant began to dissolve into skepticism. Conversations in the neighborhood grew longer, more open, less cautious. People compared experiences, timelines, fines, warnings, and inconsistencies, discovering that what they had once accepted as isolated incidents were part of a broader pattern. My lawn was no longer the focus of frustration, but a reference point for understanding how authority operated. The association's threats of intervention loomed, yet each day they hesitated eroded their credibility further. I remained steady, continuing to document, to observe, to allow the yard to exist on its own terms. The fines accumulated in theory, but their power diminished as their purpose became clear. They were tools meant to coerce, not correct, and once that truth was visible, their impact weakened. By the end of the 4th week, the neighborhood stood at a quiet crossroads. The association had pushed as far as it could without acting, and the community was watching to see whether it would follow through or retreat. The jungle had not yet overtaken every lawn, but its influence was unmistakable, spreading not just through grass and soil, but through perception and belief. Whatever came next would force a reckoning, not just over lawn height, but over who truly controlled the space people called home, and whether that control could survive once its foundations were exposed. The 5th week unfolded like the slow tightening of a storm front, the kind that darkens the sky gradually enough that people keep convincing themselves it will pass, even as the air grows heavier with every hour. The association had reached the edge of its patience, and the neighborhood could feel it. There was a new sharpness to the atmosphere, an unspoken sense that something decisive was coming, even if no one yet knew what form it would take. My lawn had become a permanent feature of conversation, no longer framed as a problem to be solved, but as a fact to be reckoned with. It stood unchanged in its refusal to submit, taller and fuller than before, not chaotic but deliberate, its growth steady and unapologetic. The association's notices now arrived with near mechanical regularity, each one a variation on the same theme, warning of imminent corrective action, outlining costs that would be passed along, invoking authority with increasing urgency. Yet for all their threatening language, nothing actually happened. No crews arrived, no forced mowing took place, no public confrontation occurred. This hesitation spoke louder than any fine ever could. It told the neighborhood that the association was unsure, divided, perhaps even afraid of what enforcing its will might trigger. That uncertainty spread quickly. Residents began watching not just my lawn, but the association itself, waiting to see whether it would act or retreat. In the meantime, the subtle rebellion continued to grow. Lawns across the neighborhood began slipping further out of compliance, not in dramatic displays, but in small, intentional choices that signaled awareness. Grass grew longer by design, not neglect. Edges softened, weeds were tolerated, schedules shifted. These were not acts of laziness, but of quiet resistance, expressions of a newfound understanding that the rules were not immutable laws of nature, but constructs enforced by people who could be questioned. The association responded unevenly, issuing warnings to some while ignoring others, creating confusion that only deepened skepticism. Every inconsistency reinforced the growing belief that authority here was selective, not absolute. I continued my documentation with renewed focus, aware that the situation had reached a critical point. I recorded not just violations, but reactions, the way patrol vehicles lingered uncertainly, the way notices arrived late or contradicted previous ones, the way board members' properties remained untouched despite visible issues. The pattern was undeniable. This was not a system enforcing standards, but one struggling to maintain the appearance of control. Meanwhile, the yard itself continued to evolve into something that defied easy categorization. It was no longer just tall grass or wild growth, but a living demonstration of what happened when land was allowed to exist without constant interference. The ecosystem had stabilized, insects thriving, birds returning daily, the space quieter and more vibrant than the manicured lawns surrounding it. Neighbors noticed. Some lingered openly now, no longer pretending to adjust mailboxes or shoes, but standing and looking, curious rather than judgmental. The association's warnings about declining property values rang increasingly hollow in the face of visible reality. Nothing had collapsed. No catastrophe had followed. Life continued, perhaps even improved. The fear that had once governed behavior lost its potency as evidence mounted against it. Conversations shifted from cautious complaints to open critique. People spoke more freely about fines they had paid without question, rules they had followed without understanding, authority they had accepted without scrutiny. My lawn was no longer the outlier, but the proof that questioning was possible. The association, sensing this shift, attempted to regain narrative control through generalized communications about community pride and shared responsibility. These messages felt disconnected from the lived experience of residents who now saw the gap between rhetoric and reality. Pride, it seemed, had been defined narrowly, equated with uniformity rather than care. Responsibility had been enforced selectively, not shared equally. The association's internal tension leaked into the open through delayed responses and conflicting directives, further eroding confidence. By the end of the 5th week, the neighborhood existed in a state of suspended anticipation. The association had threatened action repeatedly without following through, and that inaction had become its own statement. Authority that announces itself without acting loses credibility, and credibility, once lost, is difficult to recover. The jungle had spread not just through yards, but through minds, replacing fear with curiosity, compliance with choice. Standing at the edge of my property as dusk settled, watching uneven shadows stretch across lawns that no longer looked quite so identical, I understood that the balance had shifted. The association could no longer rely on silence and routine to maintain control. Whatever it chose to do next would define its future, and the community was ready, no longer as isolated individuals, but as observers who had learned to see the system clearly. The 6th week began not with noise or spectacle, but with a noticeable pause, the kind that settles in when a system has exhausted its usual tactics and is forced to confront the limits of its authority. The association had reached a moment where every familiar lever had already been pulled, fines issued, warnings repeated, patrols intensified, and yet the result was not submission but transformation. The neighborhood felt different now, not just visually but psychologically, as if a collective awareness had quietly taken hold. My lawn stood at the center of that shift, taller and denser than ever, its growth steady and unbothered by the pressure surrounding it. It no longer looked like a violation waiting to be corrected, but like a boundary the association had failed to cross. The absence of decisive action had reshaped perception more effectively than any enforcement ever could. Residents noticed the silence from the board, the lack of follow-through after weeks of escalating threats, and that silence spoke volumes. It suggested hesitation, division, perhaps even fear of the consequences that decisive action might bring. The association attempted to regain momentum through increased visibility, patrol vehicles returning with renewed frequency, inspections conducted with exaggerated formality. Yet these displays felt hollow now, more like rituals than enforcement, gestures meant to reassure authority rather than exercise it. Neighbors watched openly, no longer averting their gaze, their expressions skeptical rather than compliant. The yard itself continued to evolve into a self-sustaining space, no longer growing wildly but settling into balance, native plants thriving alongside taller grasses, insects following predictable patterns, birds returning daily as though they had always belonged there. This stability undermined the association's warnings about chaos and neglect. Nothing was unraveling, nothing was deteriorating. If anything, the space felt more intentional than the uniform lawns that required constant intervention to maintain their appearance. That contrast was impossible to ignore. Across the neighborhood, the quiet adjustments of previous weeks became more pronounced. Lawns grew visibly longer now, no longer confined to hidden corners or shaded edges. Some residents delayed mowing openly, others experimented with alternative landscaping, native plants appearing where decorative shrubs once stood. These were not coordinated acts, but they were connected by a shared realization that compliance was a choice, not an inevitability. The association's response became increasingly inconsistent. Some homeowners received warnings for minor issues, while others with identical conditions were ignored entirely. This uneven enforcement, once tolerated as background noise, now stood out sharply against the association's repeated insistence on uniformity. Every inconsistency became evidence, every overlooked violation a reminder that authority here was selective. I continued documenting, not just the physical changes, but the emotional ones, the way conversations lingered longer, the way people spoke with less caution, the way shared frustration had evolved into shared understanding. The neighborhood had stopped waiting for permission to notice the imbalance. The association attempted to shift tactics, circulating broader communications about legal obligations and potential liabilities, framing enforcement as a necessity rather than a choice. These messages landed flat. Residents had seen too much to accept abstract warnings without evidence. The fear that once governed behavior had been replaced by familiarity, and familiarity had eroded intimidation. The board's internal strain became visible through delays and contradictions, notices arriving late, language softened then hardened again, reflecting disagreement behind closed doors. The system was no longer unified, and that fracture was apparent to everyone paying attention. My lawn, once framed as the problem, had become a reference point, a living example of what happened when rules were questioned rather than obeyed reflexively. It stood unchanged amid the shifting attitudes around it, a constant reminder that the association's power depended on belief as much as enforcement. By the end of the 6th week, the neighborhood had crossed a threshold. Compliance was no longer automatic, authority no longer assumed. The jungle had spread beyond grass and soil into perception itself, reshaping how people understood their relationship to the rules that governed their lives. The association faced a choice it could no longer delay: to assert control decisively and risk open conflict, or retreat and acknowledge the limits of its power. Either path would redefine the community. As the week closed, the air felt charged with expectation, the calm before a moment that would force clarity. The neighborhood was watching, not with fear, but with awareness, and whatever came next would determine whether the association could survive the scrutiny it had unintentionally invited. The 7th week arrived with a kind of clarity that only comes after prolonged uncertainty, the moment when everyone involved understands that the situation can no longer drift forward without consequence. The neighborhood no longer felt like a place governed by quiet rules and routine enforcement. It felt like a space holding its breath, aware that something fundamental was about to be tested. The association had delayed long enough that hesitation itself had become a statement, and residents had learned to read that silence more clearly than any official notice. My lawn remained unchanged in its refusal to submit, tall, layered, and unmistakably alive, no longer an anomaly but a landmark. It had become part of the neighborhood's mental map, a reference point for conversations about authority, fairness, and the boundaries of control. The association finally shifted its approach, abandoning the steady drip of warnings in favor of something broader and more calculated. Notices appeared across the community, not naming my property directly, but emphasizing renewed enforcement initiatives and reminding residents of their obligations under the bylaws. The language was carefully chosen, attempting to reassert authority without acknowledging the visible cracks that had formed. It was a strategic move, an effort to reset the narrative and reclaim control by spreading attention outward rather than allowing it to remain focused on a single point of resistance. Yet this strategy backfired almost immediately. By widening the scope of enforcement, the association invited comparison, and comparison was precisely what it could no longer afford. Residents began scrutinizing not just their own properties, but each other's, measuring enforcement against reality and finding the gap impossible to ignore. Warnings arrived for some while others with identical conditions heard nothing, reinforcing the perception of selective authority. The association's attempt to appear consistent only highlighted how inconsistent it had always been. The yard continued to exist as a quiet counterargument, its stability undermining every claim that noncompliance would lead to decline. It did not look neglected or abandoned, but deliberate, maintained in a different way that challenged the narrow definition of order the association promoted. Neighbors who had once been cautious now spoke openly about it, no longer framing the situation as a nuisance, but as a question worth asking. Why had this rule mattered so much? Why had enforcement been so uneven? Why had fear dictated behavior for so long? These questions circulated freely now, no longer confined to whispers or private frustration. The association's internal strain became more visible as its responses grew reactive. Patrols intensified briefly, then faded. Notices arrived with conflicting timelines, language softened then sharpened again. It was clear that the board itself was divided, uncertain whether to press forward aggressively or retreat to preserve legitimacy. That uncertainty was contagious, spreading through the community as confidence in the association's authority eroded further. I continued to observe and document, aware that the story unfolding was no longer about a single lawn or even a single neighborhood. It was about how systems of control rely on routine and silence, and how quickly they falter when questioned openly. The lawn had become a mirror reflecting those dynamics back to the community, forcing people to confront assumptions they had never examined. By the end of the 7th week, the neighborhood had reached a point of no return. Compliance was no longer the default, and authority was no longer unquestioned. The association faced a choice it could not avoid much longer, and whatever decision it made would either confirm its power or expose its limits permanently. The jungle had spread not just through grass and soil, but through awareness itself, and the community stood ready to see what would happen when the system finally acted. The 8th week did not arrive like a surprise, but like the inevitable result of everything that had already happened. the moment when tension stops simmering and begins to harden into resolve. The neighborhood had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and everyone could feel it. The association's authority no longer hovered invisibly over daily life. It had become an object of scrutiny, weighed and measured by the very people it once governed without question. My lawn stood unchanged at the center of this shift, not as a provocation anymore, but as a constant, a reminder that the rules had failed to bend reality back into compliance. It had grown into itself, no longer expanding wildly, but settling into a rhythm that made its presence feel permanent. This permanence unsettled the association more than defiance ever could. Temporary rebellion could be punished or outlasted, but permanence demanded acknowledgement. The board's response reflected this discomfort. Communications became more formal and less frequent, as though each message now required consensus that was harder to reach. Language grew cautious. References to enforcement softened with reminders of community values and shared goals, signaling an attempt to reclaim moral authority rather than legal dominance. But the neighborhood was no longer receptive to abstract appeals. Residents had seen too much, experienced too much inconsistency, too much selective pressure to be swayed by rhetoric alone. Conversations shifted again, becoming less reactive and more strategic. People discussed not just what the association was doing, but why it was doing it, questioning the purpose behind rules that seemed designed to control appearance rather than support living. The lawn had sparked these conversations, but they no longer revolved around it directly. Instead, it served as proof that questioning authority did not lead to immediate ruin, that alternatives could exist without catastrophe. The association attempted a new tactic, encouraging compliance through peer pressure rather than direct enforcement, relying on social discomfort to succeed where fines had failed. This, too, fell flat. The social fabric had already shifted. Where once neighbors avoided eye contact for fear of association with dissent, they now met openly, sharing observations and experiences without embarrassment. The fear of standing out had been replaced by a curiosity about standing together. Lawns across the neighborhood continued to diverge from uniformity, some dramatically, others subtly, but all reflecting a growing confidence in personal choice. The association's patrols became rare, almost symbolic, their presence no longer commanding attention but provoking quiet skepticism. Notices that did arrive were met with indifference rather than urgency. People read them, discussed them, and then returned to their routines unchanged. The power of the notice had evaporated. My own role shifted as well. I was no longer simply resisting. I was observing a transformation unfold in real time. The documentation I continued to collect captured not just violations or inconsistencies, but moments of awareness, neighbors pausing to talk, routines altered without apology, authority questioned without fear. The lawn remained a physical anchor for these changes, a visible reminder that the system's threats had failed. It had become clear that the association's strength had never come from the rules themselves, but from the belief that those rules were unchallengeable. Once that belief dissolved, enforcement lost its teeth. By the end of the 8th week, the neighborhood felt like a different place entirely. The silence that once defined it had been replaced by engagement, by observation, by a collective understanding that control was not as absolute as it had seemed. The association stood at a crossroads it could no longer avoid. It could escalate publicly and risk exposing its limitations in full view, or it could retreat quietly, allowing the changes already in motion to redefine the community. Either choice would mark the end of an era. As the week closed, the lawn stood quietly in the fading light, no longer a jungle threatening to spread, but a settled presence that had already done its work. The real transformation had taken place not in soil or grass, but in perception, and that change was irreversible. The next chapter would not be about growth, but about consequence, about what happens when a system built on control confronts the reality of its own fragility. The 9th week arrived with consequence written into the air. The unmistakable feeling that the long tension had reached a point where it could no longer be contained by quiet adjustments or careful wording. The association could no longer rely on delay or ambiguity, because the neighborhood had learned to interpret silence as weakness rather than authority. My lawn remained unchanged, not taller in any dramatic sense, but fuller, settled, self-assured, as if it had completed its transformation and now simply existed on its own terms. That stability became its sharpest edge. What had once been framed as disorder was now routine, and routine has a way of stripping fear from even the most rigid systems. The board's next move finally came, not as another warning slipped into mailboxes, but as a formal escalation that attempted to reassert dominance in one decisive stroke. Notices were distributed community-wide, announcing a special enforcement review, a phrase carefully chosen to sound procedural rather than punitive. The intent was clear: to demonstrate that the association still held the ultimate authority to correct what it deemed violations. But the neighborhood had changed too much for this gesture to land as intended. Instead of panic, the announcement sparked analysis. Residents compared the language to previous notices, noting the absence of specific threats and the careful avoidance of naming any single property. This vagueness was not strategic restraint, it was caution, and everyone could see it. The association was trying to move without provoking the very confrontation it feared. Patrols resumed briefly, but they felt performative, vehicles slowing, stopping, moving on without action. The spectacle lacked substance, and people recognized it for what it was. Conversations shifted from speculation to expectation. Neighbors spoke openly about what the association could realistically do and what it likely would not. The fear of forced compliance had faded, replaced by the understanding that enforcement required confidence the board no longer possessed. The lawn had done its work. Across the neighborhood, more yards crossed visible thresholds of noncompliance, no longer subtle or accidental, but openly intentional. Some residents allowed grass to grow unchecked for weeks. Others replaced traditional turf with native plants outright, signaling a rejection of the association's aesthetic standards. These actions were no longer reactions to my lawn specifically, but expressions of autonomy inspired by the realization that enforcement was neither uniform nor inevitable. The association's attempt to assert control now faced a collective environment that no longer accepted unilateral authority. Internally, the strain became impossible to hide. Communications grew delayed and contradictory. References to enforcement softened even as the board insisted on its necessity. The language of obligation gave way to appeals for cooperation, a telling shift that revealed how far the balance of power had moved. I continued documenting, but my role had changed. I was no longer recording resistance, I was recording outcome. The evidence showed a system struggling not against one homeowner, but against a community that had learned to see it clearly. The lawn stood quietly amid this shift, no longer the center of attention but the origin point, a reminder of how small acts could expose large truths. By the end of the 9th week, the association's authority existed mostly on paper. Its presence felt more as habit than force. The neighborhood no longer waited for approval to act, and that independence could not be undone. The final question was no longer whether the association would win, but how it would respond to a loss it could no longer prevent. The stage was set not for escalation, but for reckoning, and the answer would define what remained of the system that had once ruled by silence and fear. The 10th week arrived not with conflict, but with resolution, the kind that settles quietly after a long struggle when everyone involved understands that the outcome has already been decided. The neighborhood did not wake up to sirens, crews, or public displays of authority. Instead, it woke up to normalcy that felt different than before, a calm shaped not by obedience but by awareness. My lawn remained exactly as it had been in the days leading up to this moment, stable, balanced, alive, no longer growing outward in defiance but existing inwardly with confidence. Its presence no longer provoked reaction because it no longer needed to. It had become part of the landscape, a constant reminder of a transformation that had already taken place. The association's final move came quietly, almost imperceptibly, marked not by enforcement but by absence. Notices stopped arriving. Patrol vehicles no longer slowed conspicuously in front of my property. Communications from the board shifted away from enforcement language entirely, focusing instead on neutral updates, maintenance reminders, and generic community information. There was no announcement of defeat, no acknowledgement of change, but the silence spoke clearly enough. The association had chosen retreat over confrontation, preservation over dominance. It had recognized, whether openly or not, that asserting control now would only confirm its fragility. The neighborhood noticed immediately. Residents did not celebrate openly, but they adjusted instinctively, moving through shared spaces with a different posture, less guarded, more assured. Lawns across the community continued to reflect personal choice rather than rigid compliance. Some returned to meticulous maintenance out of preference, not fear. Others embraced longer grass, native plants, or alternative landscaping openly, no longer concerned about reprisal. The uniformity that once defined the neighborhood dissolved into variation, and rather than chaos, what emerged was character. The association remained in place, but its role had changed. It no longer governed by intimidation or selective enforcement, but existed as an administrative body, limited by the awareness of those it served. The rules still existed on paper, but their power had been redefined. They were guidelines now, not weapons, subject to scrutiny rather than blind acceptance. The lawn had never needed to spread further. It had already done what it needed to do by standing its ground. The real jungle had grown in perception, in understanding, in the collective realization that authority derived from consent as much as structure. People had learned to look closer, to question patterns, to recognize when systems relied more on fear than fairness. That knowledge did not disappear once the immediate conflict ended. It settled into the neighborhood like a new foundation, subtle but enduring. My documentation came to a natural close, not because there was nothing left to record, but because the story had completed its arc. The evidence showed not just a challenge resisted, but a system transformed through exposure. The association had not been overthrown, but it had been reshaped, its limits clarified by the very community it once controlled without resistance. The lawn stood quietly in the afternoon light, insects moving through it as they always had, birds settling without concern. It was no longer a statement, no longer a protest. It was simply a yard allowed to exist on its own terms. Neighbors passed without hesitation, some glancing briefly, others not at all, the sight now unremarkable because it no longer carried tension. The extraordinary had become ordinary, and that was the final victory. The neighborhood had learned that order imposed without fairness could be questioned, that compliance was not synonymous with harmony, and that small acts, when observed closely enough, could expose the foundations of power. The association continued on, quieter, more careful, aware now that its authority depended on transparency and consistency rather than assumption. And the jungle, once feared as a symbol of disorder, remained as proof that growth, when left alone, often finds its own balance.